All right, welcome to our fourth workshop. This one is going to be we're going to talk about writing dialogue, and we're going to talk about some marketing tools today. So let's get started. So what we mean by marketing tools, we're going to talk about loglines, which you may know as elevator pitches for our stories, taglines, and blurbs. There are quite a few slides to get through and a few exercises, so I'm not 100% sure we're going to get all the way to blurbs, but we're going to try and do all of these in one session, so we'll see how we go. All right, so let's start by talking about dialogue. So I thought we'd start talking about this. We're thinking about what purpose does it serve for us in our stories? Because this helps us understand how to put it together. So what does it give us? One of the first big things it gives us is characterization. And it allows them to speak, and that can tell us a lot of important stuff about our characters when we can hear them talking. So like one of the big things is what words they choose to use, and the types of words they use. For example, the words they use might tell us whether they're a technical person or more of a lay person in whatever they're talking about, how familiar they are with certain areas. It can tell us about their class, their background, their culture, their profession, and similar kinds of things. So, there's quite a lot involved in what, as soon as you hear someone talk, we're making a whole bunch of assumptions about them, which may or may not be true, but it is something that as writers that we can use on the page. When it comes to the kinds of words they choose, it also tells us something about their character. I mean, for example, it's a character who might use really, really short words. They tend to be they can be terse, they can be quite gruff, they can be quite straightforward. Someone who uses a lot of longer words may have a more intellectual background or want to sound like they have a more intellectual background. And, there's also how much characters talk as well. If you compare, for example, Geralt and Jaskier in The Witcher, or Dandelion, if you prefer, from the books, from someone who says a very few words versus someone who just talks for a living. So the words we put in their mouths do tell us quite a lot about who they are, but also what they don't say. So questions they refuse to answer or skirt around, stuff they just like to keep to themselves, places in conversations where they're not saying anything at all. That can also tell us quite a lot about a character. So it's always good to remember in dialogue that space can be just as indicative as how we fill it with their dialogue. But as usual, please shout up if you have any questions or comments. I am keeping an eye on the text chat. Obviously, you're welcome to jump in the voice if it's working for you today. So otherwise, I'm just going to keep carrying on through. So other stuff that dialogue gives us, it does tell us a lot about the relationships between the characters in the scene. So how characters talk to each other, talk to specific people, does show us what kind of relationship they have. You would talk to a parent differently than you would talk to a friend, than you would talk to, say, a customer at work, if you work in any kind of service industry. You can look at things like respect and whether there is any in the conversation. You can think about things like if they've got a shared language for certain things, can tell you something about their relationship and stuff they have in common or not. Nicknames, they don't go overboard with those because they can get super confusing. But how comfortable they are with someone versus how formal the person might speak. And also like relative power balances in the conversation can tell us a lot about how these two characters relate. And yeah, that's really true, Wax. Like, yeah, what they don't have to say to each other, sort of assumed knowledge or common knowledge between two people does tell us a lot about them as well. Yeah, I like that. Um, so it's, and a lot of this stuff is often picked up as well, like as part of a natural conversation. Um, you don't necessarily have to like refer explicitly to these sorts of things, but it can be something to look for if you're looking for ways to improve. Good dialogue should give us at least some plot progression. It should be relevant to your story. It might be nice to talk about the puppy down the road, but if it's not terribly relevant to your story or tell us anything about their character, then perhaps we don't need to read about it. But it is also a good way to progress plot points if a conversation of some kind will help with that. Similarly, there's also important information that characters can exchange that also gives it obviously to your reader. You can also reveal a lot about motivations as well, and attitudes towards certain things. So, and that can all be kind of important information and context for your story. So that can all be useful stuff to build in. So while this one is here and something great that dialogue gives us, there are a few caveats to that. So I'm going to come back to this one because this one does come with a bit of a caution sign on it. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. Conversations can be a good way to create tension, sort of building up tension and showing it, particularly between characters, but also in a more general sense as you're progressing your plot through. Dialogue it can be quite fast paced depending on how you write it, and help to kind of build that up sort of as a general thing in your story, particularly if the characters are not getting along, because that's always fun to write. Anything else that we think dialogue gives us that I have not covered? See someone typing. Subtle world building is under, yes, I would say important information. Yeah, I do think that you can give a lot about a world, in the dialogue, in some of the terms they use, in some of the more colloquial speak, perhaps. But yeah, subtle world building, you can definitely build in here. Yeah, I would include that in important information. Yes, but good point. I hadn't mentioned that one. All right, moving along to things we should avoid in dialogue. Now, some of this is going to depend on your genre, because one of the key things is really we don't need to listen to small talk. What most advice will tell you is we don't need them to say hello and goodbye necessarily. We don't need them to ask about the weather and how your brother's doing and, how's your gammy foot necessarily, unless it's relevant to the story. Really, in dialogue, you want to get to the meat of the conversation, to the stuff that is really important to have on page, or like on screen is how I kind of think about it. In TV shows and movies, I think they kind of take this a step too far, where no one says goodbye on a telephone call. They just hang up on people, which is a little rude. But but in a written story, it's a little it's a little less rude. You're more kind of trimming the edges, um, in in the text, so that your reader will kind of fill those gaps in, unless you're making a point of your characters hanging up on someone and being rude. Um, but generally, it's pretty normal to avoid that small talk, um, and really just you can just get rid of the fluff and get straight to the bit of the dialogue that we really care about. Ultimately, similarly, and this is where I come back to important information. Lectures lectures are a bit complicated because a lot of classics you read, characters do go off on these massive discussion or monologues is the word I'm looking for, and will lecture. And I would say reading habits and preferences have changed, and modern audiences are not really keen to sit there in most stories and read a lecture, of one character lecturing another. um, in general, I would say most of the time avoid having a character's lecture. Um, an example looks like Arthur Conan Doyle and Poe. Yes, Watts. Yes. And at that time, that was what people did in literature, in stories, is that they would use them. You can see a modern example in like any Wachowski movie. The Matrix, particularly 2 and 3, are really bad at that, for having characters stand or sit there and lecture and just talk and have these monologues, and it tanks the pacing of that story way down. Like it's a real kind of slamming on the brakes time, um, and it really bogs the story down. Um, and like I say, Wachowski movies tend to do this quite a lot, and it actually drives me a little bit bananas. um, but in text, it can also be a little bit tedious. So be a little bit careful of that. If you can make it work, then by all means do it. But it's quite hard to make that work, I would say, with a modern audience. So approach with caution. However, I've separated out info dumping because like lectures tend to be between characters generally. Info dumping tends to be trying to use dialogue to impart important information to the reader, not necessarily to other characters. And it is often preceded with a phrase like, as you know, blah, 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 blah. If a character says, as you know, it means the other person knows it, so why are they saying it? Why would that character bother? They've become at that point a kind of a vehicle for the author to be telling the reader, and that is your hand is showing at that point, and that's not great craft. It's clumsy. People tend to know that, and you have this again. You see it quite a lot in TV shows when they clearly need to tell the audience something. Um, but they don't have another way. So they have characters telling each other information that we all know that they already know, and it's a bit clunky and it's not great. Um, I assume this is sort of the difference between diegetic. Is that what that is? Diegetic or non-diegetic lecturing? Both bad. One worse than the other. I don't actually know what that is, so maybe. I mean, one example of a lecture that can work in a story is one character telling another one a story that they don't know. That can kind of work, but that's you're kind of coming away from dialogue at that point because that tends to have a slightly different form. But I don't know what those types of lecturing are, I'm afraid. Diegetic is that it's actually happening in universe, not diegetic, it's just sort of metaphorical. Okay. Okay, the difference between a character singing in the world versus a musical. Kind of. I would say I think when we're talking about lecturing, we're talking about putting, like, having a character literally stand there and have a long monologue at another character. If it's a little different if your point of view is, say, like a first person point of view where you can have like your narrator go on a lecture. That's a little different. Um, Although it's also potentially problematic. So yeah, okay, I see what you mean. Info dumping can happen in like really little pieces of information as well. It's not necessarily a lecture, but it can just be like, um, no. Hey, I'm all for learning new terms. Thank you for bringing that up. That's really cool. As a convention, um, I mean, the way I'm kind of thinking about dialogue, just so that you all know where I'm coming from, is really like the words we're putting into their mouth, and so stuff that they're literally saying out loud. Although we're going to get to internal stuff later, but so yeah, not metaphorical dialogue, but actual um, stuff we're expecting for the characters to say aloud or via sign language or telepathy or however we're framing it by text. So, yeah, diegetic, yes. We'll leave the metaphorical stuff to another conversation. Yeah. So, okay. Um, yeah. So, just to come back. So, yeah, info dumping don't have characters tell each other information that they clearly already know, unless someone's being an overbearing person and you're making a point of them being kind of arrogant like that. So, or oversharing or whatever. Um, what else we got? Okay, so one of the really cool things that you can do with dialogue is to give sort of vocal quirks to your characters and give them something a little bit distinctive in the way that they speak or certain words that they use. You can give them a catchphrase or a pet name that they call everyone that they care about. So let's kind of call it quirks for now, just something that is quite particular to a specific character. Um, it can be really cool, and again, it can help with your characterization and kind of giving them their own voice, which is great. But overusing them, like if they're using it all the time, it can kind of get a bit tired for a reader. The other thing to be a bit wary of is don't give everyone their own quirk with their vocal habits or conversational habits. If everyone's got a quirk, then none of them stand out. Everyone's just kind of speaking a little bit weird. Your characters with quirks will stand out that bit more against a more, I want to say, kind of normalized background, and it can make your dialogue a kind of chaotic if everyone's kind of got this special thing that they all do. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I would say, like, if you have specific characters that you want to give a verbal or a quirk that way. Sorry, I'm using verbal, but depending obviously on the type of communication. But that kind of just less is better than more. And it's like, and again, with any habit, if they have a little quirky smile all the time, then it gets kind of a bit twitchy if you use it all the time. Slight exception goes if characters start adopting each other's quirks to indicate their influence. Yes, yeah, what's totally true. It can be kind of cool if someone starts either imitating or starts kind of assimilating others' language. It can be a really cool story point. Yeah, or characterization point. Love it. But yeah, use a light touch. And have a think about the stories that you read or watch or listen to, however you consume them. the kind of the vocal patterns that stand out to you, or the vocal quirks that stand out to you in the way that characters talk, and see what kind of works for you. And again, a light touch is definitely better, to make it really stand out and not kind of normalized. Yeah, repetition, well, it's pretty common in, I would say, normal conversations, and the ways that we talk to each other. Having it on the page can be a little bit tiresome. Um, and and the same goes with things that the reader already knows. So if you've got something in prose and then the character says it out loud, kill one of them. Like, we don't need both. Your reader's going to pick it up, and you don't want to bog the story down repeating stuff that people already know. Um, Another bit of repetition is as well as in some of the mechanics around how we present the dialogue, and I'm going to get more to presentation on the next slide as well. If something is obvious from the spoken words or the dialogue itself, we don't necessarily need to have it repeated in the prose, and that comes into things like your dialogue tags, your action beats, and yeah, let the words stand on their own. Hey, welcome. Sorry, what you're saying, the general rule of thumb that you go with is repetition should only be done to highlight something that's changed. Yes, absolutely. If something has changed, then yes. And there are a lot of good story techniques, and you can build like motifs and themes and that kind of thing in your work through repetition. It's quite a useful tool where you have certain things that crop up every now and then. So you can use repetition really, really effectively. But when it comes to dialogue, just be a little bit careful that you're not just running over the same ground, and you are kind of presenting something new, essentially, or having it serve a purpose beyond just repeating the same information. All right. And this last one on this list of things to avoid in dialogue is not passing along information. This one is a personal bugbear of mine that drives me up the wall about some stories. And that is specifically when a couple of characters get together and something has happened that one of them should talk about to the other one, but for some reason they don't, and we have about 4 or 5 extra chapters in the middle that would have been cut out if they just had the right conversation, and there's no good reason why they didn't. And it's one of those places where I think the author's hand intrudes really artificially. So something to be careful of is, like, while they characters should hold back stuff that they wouldn't normally say, if there is something that they would say, then have them say it, or have a good reason why they didn't. I've seen so many movies that would be 15 minutes long if they'd have just had the one conversation they had the chance to but didn't. And yeah, and it's quite artificial that you've got this, you have this massive complication and this massive story, but it's not working. Sending half the romance films of history into the point. Oh, I don't know, Jay. I mean, it does drive me a little bit up the wall where they just like refuse to say a few key things to each other, and it's I don't know. It's one of the lamest kind of barriers to me, and it's just really kind of artificial. So again, if they would talk about it, just have them talk about it, or have something else happen so that they can't. So. But again, that one is a personal bugbear. It drives me batty. But your mileage may vary. Anything else that people think we should particularly avoid in when you're writing dialogue or putting it together? Okay, moving along then. All right, large amounts of dialogue. Yep, yep. Yeah, yeah. I'm gonna get to good practice, and I will come back to that to have like really long conversations. Um, yes, so I am definitely gonna come back to that one. All right. So first off, I wanted to talk a little bit about presentation of dialogue. Um, so this is sort of getting a little bit more into the technical side of it. Um, and as you can see here, I've got presentation equals logistics. And I think that is, it's just something really important to keep in mind in that when you're writing dialogue, the way that you present it is to help your reader understand what's happening. It's very similar to when you're putting together an action scene. Your logistics are really important, or your reader's going to get lost very, very quickly and not understand what's happening. So a lot of the way that we present dialogue is intended to help the reader understand who is speaking and what's going on. So I'm just going to break that down a little bit because it's one of those things that frequently gets a little mixed up. So we are going to start. I'm going to do a little bit of bring up my little demo window. And, oh, okay, hang on. There we go. Okay. So this is a conversation between actually 3 characters. And as you can see, it's a little incomprehensible in one big paragraph. So the first thing we do with paragraphing is if there is a new actor, whether they're speaking or not, there is a new actor, new paragraph. So that separates it out, and then as you're changing paragraph, your reader understands that it's a change, it's a switch. So the first thing to do is for me to remember my paragraph break. So he's saying what? Hang on. Okay. So now we understand that at each paragraph break here, it changes who is speaking in this case. Okay. So it's a little bit, I mean, another way to think of it is each paragraph break is a little bit like when the camera cuts to the other speaker in like a TV show or a movie. Again, we just helps us understand who is talking. Okay. So the second big important thing is quote marks with dialogue. This identifies the exact words that are being said. Now, there's a lot of debate between single or double quotes that people use. In general, single quotes are the American version, double quotes are UK and Australia. Single quotes is kind of becoming fairly common because the American books are quite endemic here. So you do see them quite a lot, but that's the American style. Ultimately, it's up to you which way you want to do that. I will say that if you use double quotes for your spoken dialogue, it does leave you your single quotes for other types of dialogue. So if you have multiple types of dialogue in your story, that can be a really useful tool for you. But we're going to come to that in a little bit. So you probably all know what this looks like. So I'm just going to bring this back up again. I'm not going to make you sit there and watch me put the quotes on all of these. Here's one I prepared earlier. So your open and close quotes around all your spoken words. Now, one complication that can intrude is when you have a character who has quite a big chunk of speech in the middle of a conversation, and you want to break it up into paragraphs within a single chunk of dialogue. Totally valid. That's why we have this rather large chunk in the middle here, where what you could do is to say, okay, it's kind of a lot for someone to read on the page, or it's a kind of a natural break where you sort of go, you know what, that really needs to kind of be its own conversation, but it's the same person speaking. So the way we would indicate that is you put your paragraph break in. This paragraph here that continues, we don't close the quotes, but we do open them again on the new paragraph to indicate that someone is still speaking. So that is the usual convention. Any questions, comments? Clear as mud? Another thing that can be useful as well, if you use, will your editor punch me in the face if you do this? Well, Jay, I hope not, because that is a standard convention. that is endemic. So no, your editor should be able to handle that. The other thing I was going to say about using double quotes versus single quotes is that if you have a character quoting another character out loud, as in their dialogue, it can be really useful to use different quotes between their speech and the part that they're actually quoting. Yeah, yes, Jen. Yes, if they can't deal with paragraphs within a bit of dialogue, then sack them and get a good one. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Editor litmus test discovered. Absolutely. All right. Now, tags. Does everybody know what I mean by speech tags, first of all? Yep, okay. So speech tags or dialogue tags they are a way to indicate who is speaking and potentially how they're speaking. They are really, they're called tags because basically what you're doing is you're tagging that dialogue with the speaker so that your reader understands who is talking. So at the moment, here, we don't have any idea who is saying what. Now, I've told you there's 3 characters there, but you don't know who they are, or who's saying which bit. So again, I'm not going to make you sit there and watch me type because there's a bit. So here is your version with speech tags on it all. Now, again, these serve their main purpose is to indicate who is speaking, so that you can read this through. They can appear at the beginning if you wish of the sentence. They can appear at the end. You can stick it in the middle of a bunch of dialogue. Now, the thing with these kinds of speech tags is that they become part of the sentence. That actually, this probably the second line is the best example in here, precisely. They become part of this whole. This is one sentence. Okay, so we have a comma in the middle, and the one full stop at the end. Okay, the questions are a little different. Because obviously the question mark is the question mark, but technically that is not that doesn't end the sentence. The sentence doesn't end till over here. Similarly, in this middle section, that is one sentence, technically. And again, this just helps you kind of frame your punctuation and how it kind of relates to the dialogue. So, all of the punctuation that relates to how the dialogue is spoken goes inside the quotes. So it's only when you start quoting stuff in different ways, and that's not what dialogue is, that stuff starts going outside quote marks, and that's more non-fiction than it is really fiction. So as far as dialogue is concerned, your punctuation that relates to how the thing is being said is always within the quote marks. But yeah, tags are a little bit special because they do kind of merge in and become part of the actual sentence. Sorry, I am going to come back to tags and talk more about good practice with how we do them. So yeah, I'm going to come back to them a little bit, but that's kind of the technical side of them. Let me just check my notes. Yeah, that I wanted to cover. Okay. Wow, sorry, I'm doing a lot of talking today because you're all text and typing, so bear with me while I have a drink. All good. Okay. Wow. Really? Sorry, I pressed the wrong button. Quote marks, tags. Right, next one is too much dialogue. It's almost like a lecture. Yeah, thanks, Joe. Sorry. All right, so action beats are an alternative to dialogue tags. And this is where we can have the character doing something. So you don't have to put in he said, she said. So you can include reactions, actions, anything like that. So, and again, they can help you mix it up a little bit and give you something a little bit extra. So I'll give you another example of this same little thing. So instead of like the last one, there's no tags in this now at all. This is all action beats. And they also give you a chance to, well, it introduces a bit more movement in the scene. You can give a bit more character information. It does slow the scene down a little bit when you do this. Potentially, you kind of lose a bit of that rapid back and forth. But that is also an option that you have. Okay. Any questions about those? Straightforward? All right, we'll move on. Okay, pacing. Yeah, this comes back to what you were mentioning earlier, Jay, about keeping them fairly short. So having a dialogue or a conversation scene that goes on pretty long can really hit your pacing of your story. They can become a little bit like a tennis match. And your reader's going to get to the point where they just want someone to score a point already and move on. They can be kind of exhausting to read, particularly if it's quite high tension and high energy. So yeah, keep them relevant, keep them short, keep them fairly sort of snappy and moving things forward. Unless you kind of want that little bit of a dip in your pacing. Another thing to be wary of is putting in long action beats in the middle of your dialogue between speakers. One of the books we read the other month, Autobiography, was a little bad for this, where one of the characters would say about 3 words, and then the other character would have about a paragraph of reaction, and it was like quite a long gap before you get to this second character responding. And I'm like, how long has this person been waiting for a response? It really drags out what is essentially quite a simple conversation, and they packed in quite intense and quite detailed reactions to everything that was said, and it was a lot. It was a lot, and it really kind of stretched out a dialogue scene. So definitely keep an eye on your pacing, and I think keep in mind as well that we don't need to see a character's reaction to every single thing that is said as well. Comes under the general umbrella of almost every line should give you something new. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing with action beats as well is that if it's obvious from the dialogue what that action beat is going to be, leave it out. It comes back to that repetition I mentioned earlier. We don't need to see it twice. And so with overly long arguments, yeah, absolutely. Have someone bust in with a gun if you have to. Just make them stop talking. Yeah, if we've established that particular characters like to argue, we don't need more scenes of them arguing. I totally agree, Wox. Yeah, unless there's some other purpose in there, unless it's new information. And there's also an option that you have is to tell us what's happening in the prose. We don't necessarily need to see them arguing all the time if we already know that they argue a lot and what that probably looks like. So this is where you can sort of play with the show don't tell advice a little bit looser, potentially. But I'm going to come back to that bit of advice too. All right. Yeah, and the last bit I wanted to talk about with presentation is internal versus external dialogue. So internal dialogue can be thoughts in the character's head, them talking to themselves internally. It can also be things like telepathy and different kinds of conversation. Really, it's really good to use your presentation to indicate what's what, so your reader can again. This is so your reader can follow what's going on without reading it 4 times. And again, I'm going to come back to what I was saying earlier about the quotes that you use can give you more tools to do this. So for a slightly different one, you can use single quotes to indicate the internal dialogue that's going on there. Another one you can use is simply, if you're using single quotes, is to use italics. It's also another convention that can be used. I think those are the 2 that I'm most familiar with seeing. So Jen, you're saying, yeah, Kevin Hearn does this well. I use italics and the pointed brackets to indicate mind-to-mind communication. Yeah. Yeah, so it would look like that to indicate, say, an actual telepathic conversation. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, in some stories, you might have, I think, like text conversations are starting to grow conventions like this as well. So if we have characters just texting each other, it is a conversation, and it's really cool to quote it and have it in the story. So yeah. So again, I think the different types of conversation and dialogue can be really really useful to just to format them differently. So again, it's just about reader comprehension. Cool. All right. So that's presentation. All right. So let's talk a little bit about good practice. And this is, I'm going to come back to tags now. There's a lot of advice around about tags, and there are some polar opposite pieces of advice. One is to use as many alternatives for said as possible, and the other is don't do that. And this is why I wanted to start with, in presentation, tags have a purpose. They are there to serve a purpose, and that is to indicate who is speaking. And the ultimate thing with using said is that your readers will find it quite invisible, and that's a good thing. Because generally your tags are there to serve a purpose that just indicates who's speaking, and you want the reader's kind of focus to be on a conversation and to read through. And generally, if you're using said, they will skim right past that and pick it up and carry on. And honestly, like a lot of the advice about using as many synonyms for said as possible, it comes out like you get taught this a lot at school, and it's and that's more about building your vocabulary and using words correctly, and it's not necessarily good in practice. What we learn in practice, said is generally use it primarily, and if you use a bunch of synonyms, they become very distracting in when you're reading a piece of dialogue, and a lot of the synonyms also go sorry, what was you saying? That both a good piece of advice taken to bad extremes, like whenever you said, comes from verbs are stronger than adverbs. Yeah. And as well, like you get examples as well of some really odd choices by authors for instead of said, and some of them work, some of them just don't. Husked. Yeah, husked is not. No, you don't husk words. They're not corn. Yeah. So general good advice tends to be said should be your default and what you use most of the time. And it's good also to minimize it. Like you don't have to have it in all the time against everyone. Like that first example I showed you. Let me pull that up real quick. It's like we don't necessarily need all of these tags. You could probably cut that one and that one out at the very least. We don't need them because your reader is going to make certain assumptions about how conversations work that they're going to know who's speaking. And again, you can switch them out for action beats and not have that at all, and have something different there. Um, that works. Tags are also really good for saying how something is being spoken. So if someone is whispering, you can say he whispered. Um, if someone is shouting, you've got exclamation marks that are probably going to get that across for you. You can have he shouted if it's not obvious, but if it's obvious, do you really need to say it? Yeah, all things in moderation, absolutely. Um, I think the thing to remember is that the more you put into your tags, the more distracting they are from everything else that's happening in your sentences. So similarly with adverbs and adjectives, again, I would keep them to a minimum when you're talking about how someone is speaking. So if someone is speaking softly, then that could be worth excuse me, that could be worth saying, but maybe once in a conversation. Yeah, exactly as you say, Wox. It's about adding new information. So if a reader can infer who's speaking and how, then yeah, you don't need tags or action beats. Totally true. And I think people, writers can tend to pack quite a lot into those tags. Um, that they really don't. It's really not necessary. And it's good to really challenge your tags to see what you do and don't need there. And absolutely don't worry about interrupting. It's completely fine. I really don't mind people jumping in. So, yes. Please keep typing away and try and preempt some of what I'm saying. It's all good. And yeah, so hang on, minimizing them. Yeah, only put them in when you think that they're necessary. I mean, often, especially if there's only two characters there, having like two tags at the beginning, and then if it's a few back and forths, maybe just remind your reader a little further down to make sure that they're not getting lost in the back and forth. But otherwise, it kind of sounds a little bit like a kid's book if it's on every single line. So, and again, good for kids, less good for adult audiences. And yeah, and with the action beats, you don't necessarily need to have a reaction to every single bit of the dialogue. It can make your characters look really, really twitchy and kind of caricaturiously, almost cartoonish in the way that they're having these massive reactions to everything that's said. So be a little bit careful about putting in too many reactions. Yeah, it's a little harder when there's three characters or more than two characters in a scene because you don't have that natural back and forth. But you have to get a bit creative, flex your creative muscles. You'll be fine. Wow, I've been talking. Oh, sorry, I hit the wrong button again. Sorry, I've got to get all the way back. All right, yeah. So the next one is variety that I wanted to do. So yeah. Oh, sorry, Jen. Yeah, you're saying we don't react to every line of dialogue in a normal conversation, even when you're angry. Yeah, if it's an argument or you're angry, you're upset. Yeah. No, that's true. You don't. And you know, your reader will just assume what's happening, and they should be notable and indicate if they're finding the conversation angry or upsetting. But we don't need to be told every other line. Again, as Wox was saying, new information, please. Otherwise, we'll carry on as we are. And again, variety as well feeds into this. So you don't want it to sound like a kid's book because they are quite good with the patterns and that kind of almost roteness with some of the dialogue in the way that it's set out. But that's to train kids about how to read and how to read dialogue. Writing for adult audiences, you've got so many more tools at your disposal. Um, and so I think avoid getting into too many patterns. Um, and just going back to, sorry, let me pull this up again, to this one where, all of the tags are on the end. And it's like, even if I needed them all there, say if they were all different speakers and I needed them there, switch them up, put some at the beginning, have them switch them out for action beats. Have some variety in there to make it not get a little bit patterny, I want to say. But just make sure you're mixing it up, because otherwise it gets kind of a bit odd to read, to be honest. We have talked a little bit about variety. Consistency in voice is a big one. And this is for each character. So this is not necessarily having a character speak in the same tone and manner for your whole story. It's about having what they're saying sound like it all comes from the same person. So, things to look out for when you're thinking about how consistent your voice is in your story for this is again per character. So think about if they have like wildly different speaking manners. Like, were they super quiet at one point and then all of a sudden they're being bold and mouthing off to someone? Is that justified in your story, or is it actually just inconsistent? So have a think about whether it suits the character to be speaking that way in each scene. One tip, if you're not sure about this, or you want to kind of investigate it more, or you're not, and see how you're doing, is to first of all print your story out, or I suppose you could probably do it on screen. Actually, no, you could do it on screen, but go through and highlight all of the dialogue by a single character in the same color. So pick a color per character and just highlight all your dialogue, and then go through and read just that person's dialogue all together all at once and see if it sounds like it's probably the same person. And sorry, just catching up, Ox. A lot of this stuff, particularly when it comes to variety and consistency, it is a bit of awareness of your own habits. And if you favor certain reactions, dialogue tags, sentence structures, patterns are very easy to kind of sneak into your own writing without really meaning to. And they can start to get a bit distracting for your readers. So it is definitely a bit of awareness. Also, a good editor should help with that too. Yeah. Get some feedback if you're not sure, if you're seeing it yourself. Yes. Assign your own habits a drinking game. There you go. For adults only, please. All right, moving forward. Wow, sorry, this whole bit on dialogue is taking quite a long time. Okay. Show don't tell does sort of play into this. I'm assuming that you've all heard this advice before, that it's better to show information rather than tell it. And where this kind of feeds into dialogue is that if your character doesn't necessarily have to tell someone how they feel. They can express it in a different way. So if you have a character say, "I'm angry with you," that might be totally in character, or you can imply it by having them just be angry with that person. And how many people do we know in our lives who say baldly exactly what they're feeling? And I'm sure everyone is frustration with those of us who don't do that. So again, it's about putting the right words in their mouths. But think about show don't tell when you're doing your dialogue as to what are people What are people saying? Are they being too honest about what they're thinking and what they're feeling? Um, um, and if that suits that character, that's fine, but does it really suit that character? Yeah, things to think about. Relevance. So, yeah, make sure that the dialogue is relevant to your story. It's got to be providing something important or progressing your story. Otherwise, why is it in there? Even if it's an adorable conversation and you love it to bits and everybody wanted to talk about the puppy and it's great and there was cake, do we really need it in your story? Just, yes, kill your darlings. Kill your darlings. Absolutely. Um, and again, this comes back to the pacing and what Jay mentioned earlier as well about keeping it short and to the point, or it will bog your pacing down. All right, one other bit I wanted to talk about with good practice is accents. This is often a fun one. I don't have an example on this one. Uh, Writing accents can be interesting and fun. Um, I would say one thing to be careful of is phonetic spelling. Because the thing with accents is that all of our phonemes are different. So phonetic spelling, it can be really problematic to people who don't share your phonemes because it's not going to sound the way you intended. So I've had some really interesting reads of attempts at phonetically doing accents that don't work because just say the accent out loud, and I'm terrible at accents. I really can't do them on purpose. Mine is atrocious. So yeah. I did used to role play with someone whose character had this really strong accent, and to be honest, I could never place it because I could just about make out what that character was supposed to be saying, and I never got the ear for it. Um, and it takes a true master to really pull off a written accent, like a phonetically written accent, in a way that isn't painful to read. It's incredibly hard. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can't um, imply an accent. And there's lots of tools you can use to write a character with an accent without going phonetically throwing in all of the vowels now. Thanks very much. Um, for example, it can, well, your word choice is key. So if you're writing an accent, they may well have specific words that they say. If it's perhaps someone with an accent who has English as a second language, then there's other stuff you can do around how they talk, like a lot of people who have English as a second language don't use contractions, um, depending on where they are and how they're learning their English and how much practice they've had, um, for example. There's also accents that are, especially in English, incredibly lazy. And I do have a little bit of an example, actually. So the second one here is an example where it's not necessarily implying an accent particularly, but it is like dropping letters, for example. If they don't say a letter, don't put it in. Yeah. My personal rule of that, yes, same brain works. I would say if someone like doesn't say whole words, then chopping words off is better than trying to spell what they do say phonetically. Um, and it's a lot more readable as well. Like your readers will understand that a lot better than if I tried to add in some extra vowels to indicate how that character might be saying the words. Um, so yeah, when it comes to accents, I think Like, and throwing in sort of flavor words, like if you want to write, say, a Scottish person speaking, they have a lot of very specific way that they use words, and words that, say, an Australian doesn't use. So that will give you, I think, the feel of the accent without going overboard. And again, it's incredibly hard to read. There is one entire novel written in dialogue. I think is it actually Trainspotting? I want to say it's in Irvine Welsh, but it's written entirely in dialogue, like the narration and everything, because I think it's first person. And I will admit I haven't read it myself. I kind of want to. I think it'll be fun. Um, yeah, it is Trainspotting. Okay, cool, cool. I do remember that correctly. Yeah, and I think the good thing about um, having the entire novel in it is that you kind of get your ear in, and it is kind of your ear for me, at least, in the way that my brain does narration. Um, Once you get your ear in, the rest of it's quite easy to read. But when it's kind of one character that pops up here and there in the story to just kind of confuse everybody else, then that works a little less well for me. uh, so yeah, so with accents, think about yeah, the words they choose, the stuff that they don't say, words that run together, um, grammatical weirdness. Um, yeah, yeah, slang and colloquialisms and all of those are really fun to play with. Um, but yeah, just be aware you might need to explain some of it. Unless you can infer it by context. If you can do it by context, do that. But yeah, just what? Oh, really? You reloaded the whole? No, it's sorry. My my presentation is having a moment. So the last one I wanted to talk a little bit about was language, which is really just about swearing. Um, I know I really love a mouthy character. Um, there it is. Um, this is not first. I know that some of us write books or stories for younger audiences. Some just prefer simply not to have their characters do that. They don't want to see it in their stories. They don't want to see it on the page, and that's totally valid. Like swearing is it's quite a human thing to do, and it's quite a natural thing to do. And I think it's good to let your characters swear if they will. Um, but I think the other thing as well is that you don't have to see it on the page. So even if you've got a character who is inclined to swear a lot, we don't necessarily need to see it on the page. Um, so for example, you could just have it in the action tag to say that X swore or X cursed. Is you see that a lot. So Jen, you're saying Patricia Briggs does that with one of the werewolves? He's quite mouthy, is he? Bit of a potty mouth. There's something very cathartic about writing that type of character, to be honest. I really enjoy putting it in my dialogue. I will be honest. Swearwolves, yeah. I actually have a werewolves, not swearwolves picture somewhere. It's amazing. Like I said, it's repeated by other characters. That's amazing. Yeah. Um, but I guess just remembering that it is an option and that you can, you can decide if it's suitable for your character. You can also decide if it's suitable for your story. And, there's a lot of things that you can have in your action beats, in your prose, so that indicates what's happening without us necessarily having to hear it. So that is an option there for you. And there's no wrong answer, as Box just said. But do think about it, and I think don't shy away from it if it suits your character. Um, I think if it's weird for your character not to swear, then that's a good reason to maybe think about it. So I do have some exercises. We're not going to do them today because I didn't. Wow, it's taken an hour and a quarter to get through all of that. But these are just some things that can be really good exercises to go away to do to work on it. So one good exercise to do, yeah, simply just write a conversation with no speech tags at all and make it make sense. So think about how distinctive your characters' voices are. Think about other tools that you have to indicate who's talking and how. Give them tone. Are they whispering? Are they shouting? See if you can do it without using tags, whether you're using said or any other synonym. And if you want to go really extreme, write an entire scene with only dialogue. No tags, no action beats, no prose outside of the quote marks. So an entire. If you want to go really extreme, write an entire story. With only dialogue. And those of you who are familiar with Inspired, they do this Authors Cup once a year or so, and it's a bunch of different types of challenges. And writing a short story entirely in dialogue was one of their challenges, and I did that one, and it was so much fun. Thinking about ways to actually make it make sense and not just be people talking to each other, actually have something happening. It was really fun. Also very hard. One exercise can be to transcribe a conversation in the real world. Now, given that fiction dialogue is not entirely representative of how we really speak, with all our ums and ahs and all the rest, also you can kind of like a creep, so do be careful. So yeah, be a little bit careful with your transcribing in the real world. But it can be really good to capture the kind of patterns and speech patterns and the words that people use. Yeah, totally true, Wox. You realize how much filler and stuttering people do, and searching for the right words, and the weird shifts where you don't finish sentences and get distracted. And yes, yeah. It can be fun, and also once you've done once you've got sort of a transcription of a real conversation, try writing it again how you would write that conversation in a story, and just see how you would change it and what you would do to make it more like what we would read in a book. So experimenting with different speech patterns. So yeah, try to write someone who speaks very much not like you. Try to write someone who's really lazy with their speech and kind of slurs words together, and yeah, less creepy option is transcribing YouTube videos or TikToks, but yeah, they are often edited and a lot more polished, so less off the cuff and a little less realistic. This is true. Yeah, but that's a good option. There are sort of some less creepy options than sitting behind someone in a cafe. And the last really good exercise with your dialogue is to read it out loud, and see how it sounds to you and how it feels to you. So those are some good exercises to take away and try. Again, we're not going to do them today. That is all I have on dialogue. Is there anything I haven't covered? Any questions? Anything I missed? Any advice you've had that doesn't gel with what I've said or adds to it? Okay, there was silence and no one typing, so I'm going to move forward. Right. Okay. So we're going to move on to some marketing tools for our stories. So we had this requested, so I moved it forward in my plan a little bit. So the first one I want to talk about is log lines. So these are also called elevator pitches. So this is a sort of thing that is a really good tool for you to have for your story. So let's start with thinking about, like, what are they for? Ultimately, these are all for marketing. This is about making people interested in your story. Log lines in particular are for hooking people. So the reason they're called elevator pitches is because they're intended to be given, or phrased so that you could give it to someone in an elevator ride between a couple of floors. And it's really good, if someone asks you, hey, what's your story about? It can be really good to have one of these prepared, because you don't have to stand there for 15 minutes going, well, it's about this and kind of about that and sort of about the other thing. And this person's doing something over here and that one doesn't like it, and you kind of get this, I mean, I do it. I sort of sit there and go, I don't know, what is my story about? So having a log line ready to go is such a useful tool. And let me just move on. So they are for hooking people. It can be, whether it is talking to an editor or a publisher, whether it's talking to other writers, talking to an agent, or talking to readers if you're trying to sell them your book. So they're super useful. So you want to aim for, it's about 10 seconds to say. So like 1 to 2 sentences, 3 if one of them's really short. But one to 2 is the usual size that we want to do. Okay, so what should we include in our logline? So your main character, you probably just want to touch on 1, maybe 2, but again, it is super short. You've got 2 sentences to play with. So you want to make sure you mention your main character. If it's something like a romance, then you might want to talk about 2 or however many you have in your romance. The other thing you want to mention is the central conflict in your story, and only the central conflict. So if you've got subplots, if you've got a whole bunch of different plots going on, that's not what this is for. You want to really boil it down to, what is the central conflict in my story? What is the main plot line? Keep it really, really focused, because you've got a short amount of time to give a good amount of information. So you want to give an idea about the stakes and or a complication. I'll come to complication in a second. So you've got your main character, you've got your central conflict. What is at stake? Maybe that's covered in the central conflict, depending. But it could also be like, why is this main character in this conflict? Why do they care? Why are they moving forward with it? Alternatively, you might want to throw in like a complication. Like, is the central conflict fairly straightforward, but there's a massive complication for your main character that's making it way more difficult or interesting? Is it something that actually makes this journey sound like it's going to be a lot more interesting than actually a romance story would probably be a good example of this, because your central conflict could potentially be not all that interesting in and of itself. It's the complications that tend to make the story interesting. So, think about what it is that's going to really make your story stand out when you've got 10 seconds to summarize it. Well, the summary is a bad word, but to hook someone on it, shall we say. We want to give people an idea of genre. So your genre should be pretty obvious from your logline, and not really a mystery. Now, depending on what your genre is, you may have covered it in other parts of the description, and that's cool. But something to keep in mind is that it should give whoever's listening a good idea of the genre. So that, again, this helps them know whether it's really going to be for them. And the last one that it can contain is, again, the setting. Like, what sort of setting is this? Is it in a city? Is it in a village? Is it a space station? Is it a desert? What's the general setting that we're talking about here? Again, genre may well cover it, or it may cover the genre. It's could be one or the other, or it may be obvious one of the other parts. But it can be good to give a clue. It may not be all that important depending on what your story is and what it's about. So does that all make sense? Everybody still awake? Okay, good. People are still awake. All right. Do people want to have a go? Because I do have a little exercise to put together some log lines a log line for our stories. Okay. All right. So get yourself some form of text thing. Okay. So I want you to write down 2 key things about your main character. Ah, that's good, Wox. That sounds excellent. Okay. All right, so 2 key things. I should probably do this as well. All right. So once you've got down, just note down 2 key things about your main character. It's okay, Jen. Just do one for the next story you have on your list to write. That's fine. Okay, so now write down something about the central conflict using only 5 words. So see if you can get it down in 5 words. Okay. Now let's see if write down what's at stake for your character, or if you prefer, a complication. Again, 5 words only. Okay. Next one, just note down what the primary genre of your story is. So if it crosses multiple genres, pick one that you think it most fits. And then just note down a key way that this appears in the story. All right. And the last one is a description of the setting using a maximum of 3 words. So this is really about just boiling your story down. wasn't what I wanted. That's better. Okay. Everybody good? Done all of those? All right. So now I want you to take all of those things, or as many of them that don't repeat themselves, and combine it into 1 to 2 sentences. And one fun thing can be make the second one a question, but you don't have to. How are we doing? Is everybody done? Oh, you can't hear me anymore, Jen. Still thinking. Okay. It's pretty quiet, but I am talking. Hang on.
Hello?
Okay. Yep, I can hear you a little. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Is that any
Excellent.
better
You're
on
still a
the
little
vocal?
muffled.
How that is?
All right. Well, hopefully you've got something. I popped mine up. I threw together a quick one for the first pork novel. It's not necessarily a good one, but it's a starting point. Hopefully you've all got a little something there. You are welcome to share them if you wish. You don't have to. I love it, Jen. That's great. That looks great, Wax. Love it. That is a lot of fun. Nice, Jay. Very good. All right. I would perhaps just use gymnastics. Very good. Well done. All right, let's move on to taglines in the interests of time. So, thinking about taglines, let's have a look. Okay, so taglines are another marketing tool. That these are the taglines that usually appear on book covers, on posters. It's not a subtitle so much as kind of a short bit about that gives you a hint of the story. So these ones. So again, it's another marketing tool. These are more for setting a mood of the story and for intriguing people into picking up your book or story. So these ones are much shorter than your log lines. They're usually one, maybe two short phrases, but they tend to just be one short phrase. And you're talking like 1 to 2 seconds to read. So don't try to pack a lot in there. It's got to be really short and snappy and really a single idea. So these ones, they really want to contain just this, like a central idea for your story. And again, it is about mood setting. It's about really giving the emotional tone of your story. and preferably the genre, maybe. Particularly if it's not obvious from the title of your book. So, for example, when it comes to setting the emotional, the tone, if it's a romance story, you might not want to give horror vibes. But similarly, if it's a horror story, you might not want to make it sound all fluffy. So and it's really to sort of excite interest and give a hint about what kind of book it is. So things to avoid is something that's just too cliche, or too generic. Like it's got to entice people to your book. It's got to make it interesting. If it's a cliche or a generic phrase, then it's not really adding anything for you. It's a wasted opportunity. And if it's too obtuse, so people don't know what the hell does that mean, then again, it's not really doing its job. So have something that is really specific to your story, I think, but meaningful to someone who hasn't read it, which sounds a little tricky, but you'll get there. So I thought for this one, it would be fun to take a look at some existing ones because these are pretty easy to quote. So Jaws is a bit of a classic, and that one sets, that sort of thriller vibe, and it sets the tone for the movie. I know, sort of the classic quote from that is, "We're going to need a bigger boat," but that would probably be a better tagline because it's a little funnier, and it's Jaws, not Sharknado, so. I think it's good as a quote, but less good as a tagline. The Hunger Games is one of the longest I've seen, actually, when I was just looking around for some examples to share. But again, it does set out the stakes, and it's a pretty bold tone, I think, which kind of suits what I understand of the story anyway. And the last one is a Terry Pratchett. And again, I think that does quite a good job of setting the tone for one of his books, as well as kind of being, I think, quite interesting in and of itself as to what the story might be, how it might entertain us, shall we say. And yeah, this one I find less enticing. I think it's a little long. I think it's a little vague and a little generic, and doesn't really tell me anything kind of unique or interesting about the story. It indicates that it's dystopian, perhaps, but I would say that one's a little generic and to be a good tagline. Yeah, it describes 80% of the book's net genre, absolutely. And for that story, there's so much more interesting stuff that you could have thrown in there. Like, turns to face the future is, like, what does that even mean? Generic is generic. Like, what does this tell us about the story? Does it tell us anything interesting? Does it tell us anything that is not generic? It's Romeo and Juliet. Yeah. I don't find that one to be a particularly good one. It wouldn't make me pick the book up. I think, and it also doesn't really tell me the genre, while I haven't read the book, but I have seen the movie, and I know there's magic involved. But having a cursed love affair is so cliched. It's not even about magic anymore. So, um, actually, I think that was the book one. I'd be curious to see what they put on the movie poster. I didn't look that one up. Um, and the last one that tells us precisely nothing about the story is this one. And yeah, please do better than this. Life is for living. Why would you tell? How is that useful to us? I really don't understand. I think if it only makes sense after you've read the book, it's not going to do its job for you. So the whole point of a tagline is to sorry, that was oh, okay. They had very different taglines for the movie. Yeah, dark secrets will come to light. Yeah, it's a little generic, but all right. Um, Casters and outcasters. There are more of us than you think. See, that one I think is quite interesting. So, but, yeah, um, the whole job of a tagline is to interest people in reading your story. So make it attract people who don't already know what it's about, or know enough that you can interest them with it. But if it only makes sense in retrospect, then it's not really useful for you. So, okay, we're going to do this. So, we're going to have a go at writing a tagline for our story. I'm going to try writing two. We can write one if you prefer, like in the interest of time. So, of the story that you just summarised, I think, Jen, you already wrote yours. Put it up. But yeah, if you wanted to write a tagline for your story, what would it be? Okay, we got a few coming through in the chat. How long can she keep the secret of a failed exorcism? Love it. I don't know if that's a tagline I'd use, but I would probably go for something like, yeah, would you say no to a magical sword if it asked nicely? There's no height Mary can't reach. Oh, love it. Paranormal eye for the possessed guy. Love it. Well, that's a fun. All right. So I think that's everybody's had a go at those. But it can be good to write two or three and then see which one you think, or ask around and see which one speaks to people. I used to have one I used for Star Walker when I was writing it was it's a ship's log as told by the ship. I like that one. But yeah, taglines again can be super useful, and it's a really good exercise as well to kind of pick through what are the core things in your story, like what tone do you want to give it, um, yeah, what's sort of at the core of it. How do you best set up someone to be interested in your story? And oh, Jay, you're saying that cliches and generic taglines, publishers tend to love them? Maybe. That may well be true. All the advice I've been given says to try to avoid being too generic. Like you want to speak to your readers, you don't want to confuse them. Like if it doesn't make sense unless they've read your story, like if you throw in something that someone is probably not going to be familiar with, then it's not going to speak to them. Might be more the case in film. I don't know. I suppose you do get quite a lot of generic stuff on movie posters or trailers, sort of taglines on trailers. That might be a little more generic. But it's like, how do you make your story stand out on a shelf when people have got an entire bookshop to choose from? What would make them pick yours up? All right, so we are running a little long today. So we can call it there if you'd like, or we can try and get through blurbs. I've got a little bit more to talk through. Again, the exercise on this one is more a take home because they are a little longer. So do we want to try and get through this, or are we is everybody kind of done for today? How are you all feeling? Go down, hang out for another 10-15 minutes, hopefully. You all know I can talk, so all right, we'll keep going. Okay, cool. And Wox, yeah, just you were saying that taglines were more unique and fun a few decades ago. Maybe that's true. Maybe that is true. I mean, all the advice I could find was sort of saying to try to be more, to stand out more, I think, and to try to avoid the generic stuff quite so much. I don't know. I guess it's a tough line to draw. But you know, maybe if we all write really, really fun ones and we sell our books, then we prove our point. All right, moving on to blurbs. Okay, so we've talked about, excuse me. So we've talked about loglines and taglines, and those two are really good for making people pick your book up. So again, in the entire store, or in a slush pile, or in a day full of pictures. What is going to make someone pick up your book? And that's really like where the loglines and the taglines really help you. Blurbs, on the other hand, they're for making people buy your book. So once they've got it in their hot little hands and they're already, they've already piqued their interest, the blurbs are what make people take them to the counter and pay for them. These are more for hooking readers. So the other two, I mean, are really useful as well with like publishers, agents, editors, that sort of thing. Blurbs are really more for readers. You'll probably want one to if you're talking to a publisher as well. But readers is really where they shine. And while this does talk about like that thing on the back of the book, yeah, ideally, for those books that have an actual blurb about the book and not just a list of quotes about how good it is. I must say, when I pick up a book, I want to read a blurb on the back because otherwise, I don't know if I want to buy it. A long list of quotes. Yeah, yeah. I don't mind like one on the cover, but that a list of quotes does not make me want to buy a book. Understanding whether it's a book I want to read, that's what makes me buy a book. So for your length, like how long a blurb should be. So blurbs are not only on the back of the book; they're also the what you see on an online store if you're buying it online. And generally, whether it's physical or ebook, in online stores, there's often actually two descriptions in the store. So often you'll have a short one, which is about 100 words, and they'll sometimes have a long one, which is you want to have about 200 to 400 words. So it can be really good to write both of these and have, like, they both kind of serve the same purpose. If nothing else, it's a really good exercise to go through to see if you can write a blurb that works as 100-ish words, 150 maybe max. But you can also kind of spin it out and make it a little bit more involved for your longer one. So the kind of stuff that you want it to contain is very much what we've already been talking about with your loglines. Is your main characters, your central conflict, your stakes and your complications, the setting and genre. You definitely want to give an idea. Yeah, as what she just said, like it's great to have some fantastic quote from a famous author, but what's it about and what genre is it? And most importantly, you want to set expectations. So you want to let the reader know what they're in for if they buy this book. I have read a blurb that, and don't ask me the book because I can't remember now because I was so annoyed. I think I wiped it from my memory. Where it promised this particular story on the back of the book, and it was all about this big adventure thing, and it had this crux in there that sounded really interesting. And when I read the book, it was at best a side plot and was barely mentioned at all. And I was so angry. I'd read this whole thing waiting for this thing to come up, and it's like, I would have enjoyed the book better if they hadn't have told me that stuff about it. But because they'd set that expectation by including it in the blurb when it wasn't fulfilled, I got angry. And setting the right expectations for readers to come into your story is so important because they will love you for fulfilling their expectations. If you violate that expectation, then that's just going to annoy people. So they're not going to give you a good review and they're not going to buy more of your stuff. So, and they're not going to like your story. And the blurb is very, very much your first sort of key place where you do that. And there's the title and the cover and the genre and your placement and everything else, but this is one place where you have so much opportunity here to really set your readers up and get them excited and intrigue them about your story and make them want to spend money to read it. So please do it correctly. And the other one for this is to very much the first one there, just setting the stage and very much priming your reader to roll right into your story and start reading. Okay. So moving on to, so how do we optimize it? How do we write like a really, really good blurb? So yes, Wox, you're completely correct. It's the first exposure they get to your style of writing. Um, yeah, it doesn't have to match what's in the book, but yeah, it should be indicative, perhaps, of the kind of feel that they're going to get in tone and writing style. Saying that, your blurb, industry standard is third person. So even if your story is written in first person, on the back of a memoir, the blurb is third person. Um, and this is very much a third person introduction of someone to your story. So, yeah, it is very non standard to write it in any other point of view. Um, so, I mean, generally they're all third person. So, just that is just something to run with. People are kind of used to that. And it's not part of the story, so it's fine if the voice is different. And the other thing is to make make sure your first line really really shines and hooks people. A lot of people won't read past the first line. This is your opportunity to make them read that whole blurb. On an online store, for the book description, some stores will only show the first line and you have to click to see more. And every time someone clicks, that's effort, and you have to earn that. You've got to intrigue them enough with that first line to make them want to read more, even just more of the blurb. Never mind the whole book. So it's really, yeah, no pressure. No pressure at all, Vox. But yeah, so it's worth when you're constructing your blurb, it's worth taking the time to really pay attention to that first line and make sure that you're not writing them into the story. It's not a gentle introduction. You want to punch them in the eyes and go, this is for you. You want more of this. Maybe not punch them in the eyes. You know what I mean. Grab them by the lapels and drag them with you. Thirst trap. Yeah, exactly. It is really key to know your genre, because knowing your genre helps you to understand the kind of people who will have picked up your book by this point, and really know how to talk to the readers of that genre. And knowing the conventions and some of the ways that the specific blurbs are put together. So it's worth having a read around similar blurbs to see what speaks to people, particularly popular ones, but also the kind of terminology that's used, because I think so this is where your keywording comes in, because that's very much going to match in with your genre. And again, this is about setting expectations. So readers of that genre are going to be looking for the right kind of indications that you know what you're doing, when you're playing in their wheelhouse. So, throw in some familiar kind of keywords that are going to speak to your readers. So if you're writing fantasy, you can talk about magic. And if you're writing sci-fi, you can refer casually to spaceships and traveling to different planets. And you can throw in the kind of terms that not just speak to them, but kind of interest them and flip them on their heads and really interest people. Now, the reason this sort of says keyword correctly is that you've got to be a little bit careful not to go synonym crazy, and overdo it, particularly in the online blurbs. Some of the algorithms are a bit savvy with this, and you'll actually do yourself an injustice and harm your searchability, because if your blurb is just entirely keywords, then it's not going to get you anywhere. It's also important to be readable. So whilst you do want to make sure you're talking in terms that are going to speak to this genre, the type of reader that you're looking to attract, your sort of audience, and you want to put your keywords in. You make sure it's still readable. So don't try to pack a dozen details into every sentence because it's really hard to read. Don't, be wary of throwing in a lot of unfamiliar terms, like say, specific ways that your technology works or the magic works. It can be really great to throw that kind of flavor in. But if you pack it too much, then people are just going to go, I don't even know what this means. It's got to be readable. It's got to be digestible and interesting and easy to read. So if someone is standing there in a bookshop and they've got this thing in their hands, then they can just read it nice and quick and make a decision then and there whether they're going to walk up to the counter and pay some money. Similarly online, I don't know what the stats are with people clicking through things, but if it's too hard to read, they can always click to another search result. So readability is key. The next one, you do want to tease them. You want to raise interest. You want to raise questions in your reader's head. You want them to want more than they have on that cover. So yeah, you want to. So you do want to tease them. Even if it's a horror, you want to tease them about the thing they can't see, or whatever's creeping up behind them. Yeah, that is exactly it, Walks. Like you're not explaining your story to them. You're trying to tempt them into reading the whole thing. And it is very much its temptation. It is teasing. It is raising questions and exciting interest and intriguing people. Make them want more. That's what you're trying to do. So in that, you've only got a very short amount of space and very, very few words. So you want to make sure that every word you're using really does its work and works hard on that page for you. Avoid repetition. Make sure that you're switching up synonyms, and again, that'll help you with your keywords too. So if you find, if anything is repeated, either cut it or reword it to make it do more work for you. But yeah, really make every word in that blurb earn its place. And the same could be said for all of these three, with the loglines, the taglines as well. Really make sure every word in there is working as hard for you as it possibly can. Or fire it and hire its friend instead. And the other one of this is it can be really good to experiment. So don't just write one, maybe write two or three and shop it around your friends or get feedback, or shop it around the WordFam group, and see which one gets you the right kind of responses that you're looking for. See which one speaks to people, or see how they're reacting. Can be really good. So, and again, on these ones, try to stay away from the cliches, and being wildly generic. If you're writing a hero's journey, tell us what's interesting about yours. Skip the boring bits per se, or skip the generic facts and focus on the stuff that makes your story different to anything else we've read. And you try not to be too obtuse. Try to make sure it speaks to people who have not read the story, because this is how they get there. And really, see what you can. Try to focus on what makes your story stand out in the market, because that's what's going to help you kind of get the attention you need. This is not a summary of your story. While this is going to be quite high level, in some regards, it's not a summary of your whole story. This is really a way to get them excited, and as Wax said, you're not explaining the story, you're really explaining why they should buy it. So be wary of trying to summarize the whole story. Setting expectations is a little different. That's more like giving them enough hints that they know what they're in for without giving everything. And similarly, don't spoil. This is not the place for spoilers. I have actually read a blurb that spoiled the major plot twist in the book, and I think it was a mystery too. Again, it annoyed me, so I probably forgot everything about it. But yeah, and I to be honest, this one I've seen more than once, where something major, some major flip in the book was in the blurb on the back. And it's like you went to all that effort in writing it, um, uh, in writing this book, and putting in a plot twist and changing it up, and you had to tell us what it was. I mean, hint that there's something in there by all means, but don't tell us what it is. And yeah, I'm the same, Wax, about not being annoyed by blurbs that tell me about things that don't happen till halfway through. Yeah, yeah, because I'm the same. I sit there reading through it and I'm waiting for the stuff that I'm expecting to come up. And if you make me wait too long, I'm going to start to get annoyed by that. Yeah, I read one blurb that revealed the end of the book, and I didn't read. It's not obvious until you actually read the book, and you have to wait till the end to find it. And I'm just like, yeah, you want to, yes, you want to interest them in your blurb in all the other stuff, but you want them to get past the blurb content fairly quickly so they can focus on all the stuff you're now telling them. So, yes. Um, the other thing to not do in a blurb is just tell everyone how awesome your story is. That people prefer to make their own minds up. I mean, shoppers are pretty savvy these days. They don't like to be marketed at. People don't read adverts. They scroll past ads. They don't they don't want buy this now signs. That what they want is this story for me? Am I interested? Is this going to entertain me for however long? And yeah, it's yeah. Again, that's why the quotes annoy me as well. Like I don't mind, one on the cover, but they don't mean anything to me, and it's not going to make me buy your book. Um, the ones that are just entirely a whole bunch of quotes. So that's I don't care. I don't want to be sold out like that. I want you to earn it. I want you to interest me and make me want to read your story, not just batter me with recommendations that are probably going to annoy me. Yeah, yes, yes. What famous author number 4 thinks about your book does not tell me what I would think about your book. Yes, precisely, Wax. Yeah. Not to mention that a lot of the award-winning books I've read, I've completely despised, so, or at least not thought much of. Um, so yes, that's why that's. But I get the feeling from some of the advice that I've been looking at when I was doing the research for this workshop. I do get the feeling that some authors also put in their own recommendations about how awesome their book is in their blurbs. Please don't do that. Let your story speak for itself. It'll be fine. I think on the back of pork, I should put a quote from how much my mum loves my book. Think that'll work? Yes. I mean, it is comedy, so what can you do? Funnier than famous author number 4. Yes. dad thinks pork swords are great. That's definitely what I should put on there. All right. So I do have an exercise again. Uh, this is one that if you want, you can take it away and do that one. We're not going to do it right now because blurbs are a little bit long to be writing in a workshop like this. And it can take some crafting and some playing, and as I mentioned earlier, it can be good to do like 2 or 3 different ones to see what really works for you and which details kind of float to the surface. So, what could be good as a starting point is to take a copy of your logline. So a lot of the content that you have that we put together for the logline is probably what you want to start as a base for your blurb. So grab a copy of that one, expand each piece of it. So each of the kind of the details, so a bit about your main character and a bit about the central conflict and some of the complications, and just write a whole sentence on each one. You may have more than one main character. Your blurb kind of has the space to allow for that. Again, make sure they are main character. If you're starting on side characters, you're going to set your expectations a little wonkily. Expectation is if it's on the back, they're probably a main character and going to be in it quite a bit. So your antagonist may not have appeared in the other 2, but may appear in your blurb. Probably should appear in your blurb. So you might want to write a little bit about them or at least mention them. I know, Jay, you had a couple of main characters in yours, and that's great. You can add extras if you need to. Once you kind of got a few of those, reorganizing it into an interesting stage setting read. So, setting it up, making sure it's a good tease. I know when I write stuff like this, I always have to reorganize it because the way I put it down is not the way I'd want people to read it, in that order anyway. Make sure you then, once you've got it all kind of in the right sort of order and shape, pay some attention to your first line. Make sure it really sings for you. And then take a run through, and if you find that you've repeated anything anywhere, just either take it out or reword it, switch out your terms. If you've used the same word 3 times, make sure, pick a different word. Make sure that you're really optimizing your word choices and not repeating yourself anywhere through there. And that's it. That is, I believe, everything I had on blurbs. Any questions? Any comments? Anything else that you would find useful or that you like to see on in a blurb? So you are welcome, Watts. I hope that was useful anyway in giving some information and guidance. Gosh, I think this is the longest one of these workshops has run so far. So normally I would go on to any other questions, but I think we are very, very much out of time, and I need to go and rest my voice. Okay, can I tell us about a time I encountered someone who asked me for, or there was an opportunity for me to present an elevator pitch? Honestly, anytime someone asks me, what are you writing? Yeah, I mean, I've actually pitched pork to a publisher, but that kind of pitch was very different. That's not an elevator pitch. Pitching to an agent or a publisher where you sit down and talk to them is terrifying. No, it's really good. It is also terrifying if you're me. um, but it's quite a different beast in the way that you put it together. It's more like a synopsis than it is an elevator pitch. And I can do a session on that, but that's a longer conversation. Um, but yeah, I mean, honestly, any time someone has asked me what am I writing, um, it is so useful. I have to say, when I was writing Star Walker, because it was a web serial and it was live, and anyone could read it at any time, like it's online. And so people would say, "Oh, what's it about?" And I flailed around the first few times, and then I latched onto it's a ship's log as told by the ship, and I was like, "Job done." That was the answer to that question, and I wasn't flailing, and it was easy. So I cannot recommend enough having an elevator pitch ready to go, and it makes you more comfortable talking about your story too, because you're not fumbling around for, well, there's this character and he's sort of doing this, and then this comes up and now he has to fix the world. And it does help me feel a little bit more coherent and like I know what I'm doing. uh, and yeah, so but also, if you go to writers festivals, if you go to, any kind of anything like that where people are talking about their writing or what they're writing, then it can be really good just to kind of have that in your back pocket so that you can jump in and join in and talk about what you're writing. It doesn't have to be to sell. Like I've kind of framed them here as marketing tools because they are so useful for that. Um, but part of what I think an elevator pitch is really, really good for is just making you more comfortable talking about your story. Um,
Got my mic working.
what's that, Jen?
I think I got my mic working better now.
Yes, it's
Yeah.
still a little muffled, but I can hear
Yeah. Oh, well, hopefully I don't have any work coaching sessions coming up.
you. Yeah, yeah, that's so good, Wox. When yeah, around Nano, when a lot of people are like, "Oh, what are you writing? What's it about?" Yeah, having a it's I find it tough to have them before I've written it. I'm very much a plantser that I tend to have a better idea about what a really good logline is after I've written the story. Um, but you can write it at any point and then revise it. That's fine. Um, so yeah, yeah. There is the problem of promising people a story with an interesting logline and then having to write it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you're a heavy rewriter, then definitely writing the logline and sharing it too early can be tricky. But hey, you got to write the story that it wants to be. Yeah. Alrighty. Any other questions? Well, I think we can probably call it there um, for this recording. Thank you all so much for joining us. Yes, I shall go and have a nice drink. All right, you all take care. Thank you all for joining. That's really, really been fun, and I hope you'll join on the next one.